Welcome to the Future Christian Podcast, your source for insights and ideas on how to lead your church into the 21st century. At the Future Christian Podcast, we talk to pastors, authors, and other faith leaders for helpful advice and practical wisdom to help you and your community of faith walk boldly into the future. Now, here's your host, Lauren Richmond Jr.
Welcome to the Future Christian Podcast. Today I'm welcoming Juan J. Sarmiento to the show. Juan serves as the executive presbyter of the San Fernando Presbytery. In his role, Juan provides pastoral and strategic leadership to a growing network of congregations and ministries associated with the Presbyterian Church, U.S.A. in the northwest region of Los Angeles. Born in Venezuela and ordained in Brazil, he has been in ministry and nonprofit leadership for more than 3 decades. Juan's graduate studies include programs at Fuller, San Francisco, Columbia, and Louisville theological seminaries. He has been active in helping strengthen church and leadership development movements in 4 continents. All right, welcome to the Future Christian Podcast. I am Lauren Richmond Jr., and I'm pleased to be joined today by Reverend Dr. Juan Sarmiento. So thank you so much for being here. Is there anything else you'd like our listeners to know about you?
Well, first of all, thank you, Laura, for having me. I'm a leader here in the Presbyterian Church in the region of Los Angeles, and been serving in this capacity for the last 3 years. And prior to that, being involved in several countries in kind of Christian-related efforts in different capacities.
Wonderful. Would you share a little bit about your faith journey, kind of what that looked like in the past and what that looks like today for you?
Surely. I was born, as most Latinos, into a Roman Catholic home. Grateful for that. And at age of 14, had a very life-changing kind of moment in a Presbyterian setting in Venezuela, in South America, my country of birth. And yes, there are people that are not Roman Catholic or that Christians that would see themselves in kind of the Reformed tradition, a way of looking at life and discipleship. And that set in motion a process of being better equipped and serving. I lived in Brazil, and then Southern California later, and I'll continue to grow and be amazed at this fascinating thing that is a Christian life.
Great. What is a spiritual practice that's meaningful for you?
It has changed over time. One that I'm practicing right now is listening to the Bible. Something that probably a lot of your listeners practice is the Bible in a year. I'm going through that, going through the book of Joshua and the Psalms and the book of Acts, and while I walk in the morning. So that is a very grounding experience, reminding me of things that I've heard or I thought I knew, and that I'm getting to know again and seeing myself in light of these wonderful stories and texts that we find ourselves as heirs of.
Mm-hmm. Well, for our listeners, to kind of introduce our conversation, would you mind kind of talking about your judicatory, your context that you serve in, and some of the ins and outs of the work you do there?
Sure. The Presbytery of San Fernando is what is called a council of the Presbyterian Church, U.S.A., an expression of Church Universal. And it is located in the northwest part of Los Angeles. We started in 1968 when the Presbytery of Los Angeles became about 4 or 5 regional bodies in the Presbyterian Church.
Wow.
And we are, at this point, about 23 churches, network of churches. And a very significant element of our work is just the starting of new churches and new communities of faith that right now outnumber the 23 established congregations.
Wow.
And our place of vibrancy and Presbytery as a whole has benefited from this effort in the last couple of decades of this adventure of starting and engaging what God is doing in our communities.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm excited. I want to hear more about the new church efforts here shortly. But I had Juan on the show partly because I kind of wanted to just talk through with him some of the challenges and perspectives that I'm seeing from other clergy, and I wanted to hear his perspective as a kind of middle judicatory leader. So you mentioned, Juan, that you've been serving here in this role for 3 years. For anyone obviously paying attention, those 3 years have come. I don't even want to say it, but during COVID, what did you come on, like right in March 2020? When did you come on?
Yeah, no, well, it was towards the summer, so I'm heading towards the third year. This has been a time of certainly a lot of changes, to say the least. I think what I was doing before, involved in hundreds of countries, kind of helped me, gave me exposure to a kind of life of a church that is in one way or another unpredictable. And although I want to say, I mean, this is not, wasn't planning or anticipating to become the presbytery leader here. But I thought, well, if anything, my experience of seeing disruption all over the world, and Christian communities continue to thrive and continue to go forward in mission, might be helpful. In addition to the fact that, hey, 47% of our population in our region are Latino. So that's another element that I think I could bring to the work of our network of churches here.
Yeah. So it's an interesting dynamic, I imagine, here, having, you said 23 established churches. How many kind of like new efforts are there? Similar amount?
Probably we're looking closer to 30.
Wow.
And when I say probably, it's because what we experienced in the last 3 years, is only serves to highlight the fact that the church is a dynamic organism. That's what I saw in places like Ghana, in places like China. And so I think kind of the Western approach to define and confine. Well, we want to define and sometimes end up confining the work of the Holy Spirit in what is coming about in a more organic way. And so churches do close, churches do open, churches do multiply continually. And that is what keeps me on my toes and makes all this work very exciting.
Well, right off the bat, that's great perspective. I appreciate you sharing that. So I'm curious, a theme that I imagine you've seen, and certainly I've seen here again and again in these last few years, is the challenge of clergy burnout. In these two different contexts you have, I'm curious what you've seen, and then how you find yourself able to support pastors in those different contexts.
Well, I want to confess, Lauren, that when I first came to the United States, I thought that clergy burnout was kind of an American thing. All over the world. My thought was, okay, people can't afford to be burned out. You gotta keep going, right?
Right.
Until it happened to me. Okay. So you realize, yes, the pressures of ministry in the Western context are different than possibly what you find in other places. And with that also, in more recent engagement with the global church, you see a level of transparency, vulnerability, and honesty that does recognize the fact that it doesn't matter where you are, even when the church, in places where the church is growing and things seem to be, so to speak, up and to the right, there is the reality of our own humanity that is very much kind of earthen vessels, and God's own presence and glory is manifested through people that reach at times the limits of their own capacity and strength. So here in the U.S. context, it's very real. We've seen a lot of very personal moments, in addition to my own moments of challenges and exhaustion. You see it present and widespread, and that is something to be very to have very front and center. The reality of our limitations. The reality of the fact that we're trying to do something here that is risky, that is often misunderstood, that is often brings us to our sense of inadequacy. And our tendency is to deny that and to just keep going instead of recognizing, well, isn't this an opportunity for us to allow for God's grace to be manifested in our weaknesses, so to speak, and seek to help and seek healthier patterns of living and ministry that need to be approached seriously.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. So one thing that I want to dive into here that I think can feed into clergy burnout is the challenges of specifically a clergy of, the cost of education, sometimes limited pay prospects, and just, frankly, not great so-called career prospects. How are you all wrestling with that? I'm curious, like in your presbytery, in the broader context there in California, again, very high cost of living. What are some of the challenges that clergy are facing, and how are you all helping clergy and pastors address those challenges?
Well, the cost of education, the cost of living altogether in Southern California is very high. But I remember close to 30 years ago when I came to the country, I already thought the cost of private education was very high.
Right.
But now, I mean, it has multiplied. It's increased remarkably. That is a very real challenge because our work depends on the leaders that we have. I mean, we have we believe that there has to be a certain level of familiarity and study of the text and the context that will result in the quality of our leadership and the life of our churches. And I feel for people in theological education. I mean, my own denomination possibly has the most theological institutions per capita than any other, considering our dwindling numbers and so forth and so on.
Right.
Now, you will think that creates accessibility in theological education, but that hasn't necessarily because of some other dynamics, institutional and economic. I think one thing that we have tried to do is we have partnered with in the beginning of a new commission ruling elder program that is possibly less costly. Another thing that we've tried to do is beginning a process. We're going to do a campaign to raise funds for scholarships. But then in the long haul, we recognize that there have to be questions asked, and I'm glad to see folks at the Association for Theological Studies looking at alternative ways for formation of leaders. I mean, not all leaders can be adequately formed by congregations, but congregations do play an important role in the formation of leaders.
Right.
And how can we have a better increased collaboration between institutions of higher learning and theological education and congregations in forming leaders, not only in ways that will be more economical, but in ways that would result in the kind of leaders that are needed today. One thing that we've been experiencing a lot, experimenting a lot, and it sounds awful because experimentation sounds like something you do with not humans. but people that have put themselves in a place of serving bivocationally, because God has called them to do that, and we seek to support them. I think those are more viable forms of Christian ministry and leadership in today's day and age, and one that we see reaffirmed by the experience of the global church.
Yeah, about an hour ago, as we were recording this, I just had a conversation on a podcast recording with a guy out of New York City. So I've been coast to coast today, but a guy out of New York City who, that's what he does. He helps pastors kind of reframe their resume and experience in order to get, marketplace jobs.
Well, that sounds like I'm going to be listening to that podcast episode.
Thank you so much. Appreciate the endorsement there. Another question that I'm curious about that, I don't know what it's like for you again in your context, but something I see in my context is the challenge of what to do with aging buildings. So again, I'm just imagining in Los Angeles area, real estate is pretty prime time, expensive. What does that look like for churches?
Well, certainly delay or defer maintenance is one of the most significant challenges of organizations like ours that have possibly, a lot of property. It is fascinating because it doesn't look like you ever have enough of that. But if we look at things in a broader way, we have more than enough, and sometimes we don't know how to do with it and honor our past, and what those buildings represent. I think I'm fortunate to have been in collaboration with churches in Europe, and the amount of empty buildings that they have is quite significant. What I see is that the buildings tell a story that needs to continue to be told of faith and faithfulness. And then on the other hand, I do think that the Western church has sometimes get caught in a place of seeing or answering to the question, what do we do with these buildings? Instead of engaging our communities in our neighborhoods, and we've, as a presbytery, we've looked at ways of answer that question in several forms. And so, one typical way is leasing facilities. A lot of our churches are doing that. A lot of the churches that have closed or ended their life cycle to begin a new one have also the presbytery is managing some of those properties. Now, a key question is that you can only do the building management thing so long without that taking on the attention of your leaders, away from the work of discipleship and engaging and telling the story and translating the story into a new generation. So we are certainly we have sold some properties, although some people say, well, that is not a good thing to do, because once you sell the property, you will run out of money once again.
Right.
Well, there are ways in which you could sell the properties and use wisely the proceeds, and I think we're trying to do that to some extent. And as a presbytery, we've done something that other people will see as reckless, is to sell the properties and use the money for ministry, and hence the beginning of organizations like Bridges and Cyclical and others that have really been about the work that we value and that is important to us and we feel called to.
I appreciate what you said here, or what you said there about, what was it? The danger or the challenge of, becoming essentially a property management firm, right? Rather than a church or, or adjudicatory. That's something I imagine churches should be wary of, as much as it can be profitable or, and prop up a budget or strengthen a budget, that if you're spending so much time managing the building, it really, like you said, can distract from the broader mission or ministry of the church.
That is for sure. Some of the things that we've been looking into and experimenting with is the leveraging of facilities in a way that generates income, but at the same time keeps our mission front and center.
Mm-hmm.
That could happen.
What are some examples of that?
I think we have one particular church in the Sherman Oaks area looking at doing some exciting things with that. For instance, there's nothing innovative about this, but the way they have developed their preschool generates income for that then in turn is used for the life of the church and the outreach and the work of the church. Yet we understand that doesn't happen in every community. I mean, not all communities have the demographics to support that.
Yeah.
But now they are venturing into housing, and they have a very, very good plan for low-income housing that will, in turn, generate funds for the church. And we are looking at possibilities to do that in ways that don't necessarily eliminate the work that has been done. I mean, the history, the legacy of the former church, but also in ways that enables that to build on that and reconnect to its community.
Yeah, I'm glad you talked about housing there, because I was going to ask that question. So many churches have extra land, big parking lots, for instance. And especially in city centers or dense communities, that land can be very valuable to add to the housing supply. Can you talk more about what the project is, or are they ripping up the parking lot? Do they have extra land? What does that look like for them?
Well, in this case, they have excess land that they could leverage, and every square inch is valuable. So it could be, it's amazing how it could be creatively used. You could build down, build up in that even limited space that we have, that they have. And that's what we're looking into. But it is fascinating because there is a sense of loss in the configuration of the former things, of the former plant or facilities. Because as valuable as every square inch is, for the community of faith that is existing there, it also brings out memories of their past and significance to their journey of faith. And we got to respect that. And I think that is something that middle judicatories, regional church bodies need to bear in mind, that if we wipe out the memory of what previous generations did to bring us to this point, then we might find ourselves in a very significant disconnect that might not be fruitful into the future.
Yeah, I appreciate you sharing that, because I'm just thinking, churches that I've just walked into and explored in my area often have or had, I guess, like a kind of like a master plan or like a big campus kind of vision that really never came to fruition, to start with one building and then to add a bigger worship space and then, educational units and often like those never came to fruition, and those kind of big dreams have kind of been pushed off somewhere in a box. But I imagine like there's still people in that congregation who very much dream of like those bigger plans coming to fruition. So I appreciate you speaking of that loss.
You know what? There is a real loss. And I think, I appreciate, and I'm so glad that your podcast focuses on the future. Someone that has been influential to me personally has been Leonard Sweet,
Mm-hmm.
and his metaphor of history as kind of a balancing between the past and the present. And if you go into into balancing, you realize that you need to go far back in order to make it farther into the future, right?
Mm-hmm.
I think one critique I have about innovation is that sometimes we don't look at the past far enough. I tell folks we got to look past the 50s, the 1950s, to reconnect to our roots and what we're about. And then that will in turn propel us into the future in ways that we had not imagined. So imagination is important, but it is grounded in the past and in the recognition of our early days when things were hard, when we didn't have those facilities and the current configuration of things, but there was faith that propelled us to begin new things and look at new horizons.
Yeah, that's helpful to think like church existed beyond or before in the 1950s. So I'm curious,
Yes, you did.
You mentioned it a little earlier in our conversation here about, trying to do more for churches as a middle judicatory. I imagine like in your context is similar to mine where judicatories, synods, presbyteries, regions, conferences, whatever the term, the different mainline contexts used to describe their kind of middle judicatory. And it seems like the vast majority of situations they're trying to do more with less, or at least do the same with less. I know from experience that churches who are struggling often kind of can be like, hey, the denomination's not doing enough for us, and kind of just want to blame, kind of punch up, so to speak, and blame, the denomination or look for more help. What do you think is reasonable, in this era of lower resources? What do you think is reasonable more that you can do? And what do you think that you and other middle judicatories might need to say, we can probably only do less of that going forward?
Mm-hmm. Well, that's a great dilemma. How do you do more with less, right? I think one element is honesty. I mean, meeting people in a place of vulnerability, and churches in a place of vulnerability. I mean, as someone that has worked for the national church, my national, denomination, and international efforts, I realize, okay, it is important that we reposition ourselves as not the wealthy partners in the West that will supply your every need, but as fellow strugglers along the journey, companions in this journey of rediscovery of what it means to follow Christ in today's day and age, with the challenges and the opportunities that in front of us. Another element that we find is stopping. Yes, what do you stop doing is critical. As much, and you heard this, as much as what you start. You can't, there's a limit because we're not a God, to what we can begin. And that is associated with what we stop doing. So the courage to stop things is really important. I think we can model, or we can show, how to stop things. I think there is an element of pride in human nature, but also in Western culture, of saying, this is, we can keep all these things going. And I think an opportunity for us more on the innovation side is saying, listen, we stopped doing this that we started only 2 years ago, and we're stopping it and celebrating that. I think we're showing folks, okay, we're not only telling you that you need to stop doing what you did in the 1950s. We're serious about this, serious enough that we are stopping something that run its course in 2 years. And now, and that's how serious we are about stopping things that we've started. And often that doesn't guarantee that people will connect with that or find that inspiring themselves, but it does show more than just a mentality of we between or us or against them, rather than, hey, we're in this together. And we are literally relearning what it means to be church in this times. And I think COVID, needless to say, was a wonderful opportunity for us to do that.
Let me ask kind of one more question in this vein. I'm curious, we live in a very anti-institutional era where, it's almost like a mark against you if you're part of an institution or defend an institution. That being said, other guests I've had have kind of highlighted the importance of institutions as kind of cultural institutions that kind of carry on culture. Where do you think, obviously leading institution, so to speak, where do you think institution gets to, where does it help and where does it get in the way in today's context?
Well, I work for a Presbytery, so you would not be surprised for me to hear from me that I believe institutions are important. Now, let me say this. And that has to do with staying power, staying presence, more than that. I've been with the church in places like Syria and Lebanon, Egypt, and China, and in places where you wouldn't think there are Christians or Reformed Christians or Presbyterian. And one thing that we have done right is the creation of institutions where people have patterns of interaction that are able to withstand even contexts that are changing and not necessarily friendly to our presence. I do believe that institutions are very much part of who we are. And I'm concerned, frankly, at our environment in the United States, where people don't believe in Congress or the presidency or schools or the police or universities or banks. What hole are we digging ourselves into? In which there is, and I go as far as saying, yes, we're putting ourselves in a place where demagogues and people that don't have the character and the commitment to build a strong set of network of interactions, find an opportunity to misguide people into places that are far from God's peace and the shalom that God brings about. So institutions will be around as long as we're human beings. The question is, what kind of institutions will be around? I think it is for us to decide that and invite some of the folks that are rightfully disenchanted and disappointed with the status quo and the way institutions have operated to help us co-create a different kind of institutions, a different kind of Presbyterian, a different kind of church. And that is, I think, a crucial element for, not only for the future of church, but for the future of the world.
I appreciate what you said there about, the lack of institutions creates a vacuum for demagogues to rise up. And we're certainly seeing that today. And I almost wonder, Juan, I wonder what your perspective is on this. Like, to me, like those kind of demagogues, and that's kind of a harsh word, I suppose, for some, but certainly in an age where, influence comes from social media likes and follows and virality, those people become demagogues or institutions, I would say, in a way themselves. My perspective is that those vacuums, or there's a vacuum that needs to be filled one way or another from influence and perspective and leadership. And I wonder if, I imagine your perspective would be the same. Like, there needs to be quality sources of wisdom and influence. Yes?
Yes. I mean, the church is, if anything, a place that nurtures wisdom, that nurtures character, that nurtures responsibility and accountability, and that nurtures hope that is not grounded in a charismatic individual.
Yeah.
But it is grounded in something much larger, and that is where, yes, we proclaim the gospel, not as a way of denying the realities we live in, but in a way in which people are regrounded. People become anew, and institutions can be brought about that a pattern after healthier ways of living. And yes, in a multicultural, pluralistic setting, in ways that I would say embody, that's our desire and our hope, embody some of the spirit of Jesus in our day and age.
Yeah. So, speaking of institution, you talked about earlier in our conversation here, so many new kind of faith communities or churches. And it's funny thinking about it here, kind of institutional to say, like, we're not even sure on the fixed amount of numbers, right? Something very anti-institutional. I'm curious to kind of shift the conversation to new church efforts. What does it look like trying to sell, again, forgive my language here, trying to sell an institution in a way like the Presbyterian Church to people who are, in a context who they may have no familiarity with the Presbyterian Church, and most certainly they're coming from it probably at least leaning anti-institutionalist. So I'm just kind of curious, what does that look like? What have some of been the fits and starts, I guess, that you've seen or heard about?
Well, that's a great question. We, at the risk of sounding arrogant, we have no lack of people, or we are experiencing a significant influx of people that want to be part of our circles.
Okay.
And that is, I see that as God's grace. I think for us, the challenge is, how do we honestly engage in a way that goes beyond kind of the probably not so positive experiences of church and institutionalism that people have experienced in the past, oftentimes oppressive, oftentimes merely transactional, and I get your allusion to selling, right? And in a way that probably embodies more of some of our theological convictions of covenantal life together. Some of what Dietrich Bonhoeffer used to talk about. How do we, or rather than just connection, live into communion with one another that is honest, that is dignifying, that embodies God's righteousness and justice. Those are things that we wrestle with, and that sometimes we end up disappointing folks, and I could be honest about it. We're not, if we represent ourselves as the one product or provider of services that is not subject to some of the flaws and the challenges and even the mistakes and made in the past, then we're not being completely forthright. So I think the approach is highly relational, and it has to come with a great deal of also recognition of our mistakes in the past, humility, and I would just go as far as saying reliance on God's grace. That is what that we are about, and realize that it still is needed as it was in the past.
Yeah, I'm struck by how your theology, and I'm not being Presbyterian myself. Hopefully, I'm not framing this correctly or incorrectly. Excuse me, but I'm struck by how your theology kind of acts as like a, as a humility of saying, if you're experiencing growth, and I think in church context, it can be easy when you're experiencing growth and vitality to be like, oh, well, hey, this is me. I'm doing this myself, or we're doing this. And I appreciate this theme I'm hearing again and again from you about, this is God's grace. All we're experiencing is by the grace of God, not from ourselves.
Well, I think thank you, Lauren. I think, certainly Presbyterianism is just but an expression, and a small expression of the body of Christ, that is much bigger, and God's reign, God's kingdom is much bigger than we are. I've been informed by people like Andrew Root, that I know was recently in your podcast, in terms of innovation and some of the critiques of kind of the Western captivity of innovation that, Luther would talk about the Western, the Babylonian captivity of the church. I think in the U.S., we have turned enterprise, the church into an enterprise that is captive to some of the rules and some of the expectations of business life, which is good, they could be helpful, but they're limited. And someone like Eugene Peterson, a fellow Presbyterian, but not someone that would speak about that continually. At times can be off-putting in the ways he approached, the church growth mentality and so forth. But have to be present. Those critiques into our efforts as we go about it, share the good news, and with what Leslie Newbegin will call humble confidence. I think that's something that we strive towards.
Well, we're running a little long here. Do you mind if I give you one more question before we take a break?
Please do.
Okay, thank you. So I want to ask you about cyclical. You alluded to it earlier in the conversation. So as I understand it, cyclical is kind of a semi-autonomous part. Is it of the presbytery?
Yes. Well, cyclical is an expression of a presbytery's commitment to the work of starting new churches, communities of faith, developing leaders, providing an ecosystem of discipleship, and we have seen cyclical grow and draw the attention of other judicatories, other councils of the church within the Presbyterian Church and other denominations.
Yeah.
And we're grateful. We have a good relationship. We learn with one another and encourage one another, and sometimes challenge one another in our approaches. But it's necessary. That's all really good, and we're very grateful for what we've seen develop, and glad that in some ways it might be helpful to the church in other parts of the country and the world.
Yeah, I'm curious. Again, we've been kind of honing in on that theme or subject of institutionalism. Do you think cyclical do they offer that kind of counterpoint or counterbalance of newness and fresh perspectives to kind of counterpoint or counterbalance, the institution? And in that way, I guess, does them kind of being a separate institution in a way? Is that where some of the real value comes in? Is that fair?
I think so. I mean, the same person that said, I believe the church started as a movement that became a civilization, then culture, and then an enterprise in the United States.
Right.
Recognized rightfully. I mean, the church doesn't start. The church starts as a movement, but movements need institution. And I think that's a blind spot,
right?
Sociologically, even sociologically speaking, that for us mainline Protestants, we've thought we are so good at developing institutions that we have forgotten about the movement side of things. So I interpret Cyclical and Bridges and other organizations that we help get started as expressions of the fact that movements need institutions need movements. And one of the elements of Cyclical, one of the values is that it is highly pneumatological, in a sense that, we realize the Spirit is bringing about new things, and we need to be open to that. Yes, Presbyterians, we do affirm that we believe in the Holy Spirit. But yet we how do we live into that? I think Cyclical provides an opportunity for us to learn more, to live in that pneumatological expression of who we are as Christians.
And let me ask one more question here, if I may. And this is going to sound critical of Cyclical, and I know, or I've had Nick Warnes on twice, and have spoken a few times with Brendan, I forget his last name. So I've interacted with some of the Cyclical folks, good folks. I myself have worked for a kind of quasi Protestant mainline, Protestant movement that was frankly a disaster in a church setting context, church planting context. So I ask kind of from my own kind of trauma, if you will, how do you, as an institution, again, speaking of Cyclical as a kind of semi-autonomous thing, how do you all work together to say, like, hey, we want to respect that you're a movement, we want to respect that you're pneumatologically led, but also like, hey, we think you're getting off the rails here, or let's bring it back. What does that balance look like? So you're, again, kind of trying to be innovative, but also saying, like, hey, let's stay within what we believe to be the confines or the values of our presbytery, of our denomination, of our movement, sort of thing.
Well, I think it is a recognition of the body of Christ being different, having different parts. We none of us expresses the totality of God's gifts, and so we engage respectfully, and at times disagree respectfully, and yet, what can we learn from this expression that could call us closer to our life as in our vocation, our call as a people of God? I think we continually ask that question, and I've sensed on the part of Cyclical over the last 3 years a willingness to say, "Hey, you know what? You got a point, and that's probably something we need to give more attention to." I can tell you, for instance, one element that has developed over the last 3 years is Cyclical Full Circle. I think you had Rob Douglas with in a conversation. Cyclical Full Circle is an expression of the recognition that if you just say there is nothing in the institution that can be of any value to us, we're making a very significant theological mistake.
Right.
Because we affirm also in our creeds, in our confessions, that there is one church, not two. And that, and by the grace of God, also, there are different expressions that will engage people differently. Yet we are all about the same work, and we got to live into that unity of the Spirit. So, cyclical full circle comes to speak to say sessions or church boards, and engage them into a different way of looking at things, and more, I would say, faithful, and innovative way of facing the future of each congregation. So that is one way. They're publishing arm or efforts have been helpful to establish churches, and even mega churches that I heard pastors telling me, wow, that's good stuff there that we're grateful for. So we want to continue to see more of that and facilitate that engagement and kind of crisscrossing and cross-fertilizing that is so necessary for us.
Yeah. I mean, broadly speaking, I think it's a great idea just because of, like we've talked about throughout this conversation, the different competing factors of an institution wanting to kind of hold things together, something new, trying to bring newness and a new innovation, and also that it kind of need to hold those two in tension. So
I very much see that. I mean, if you look at the church history prior to the Reformation, for instance, I mean, something that has kept the church in its Roman expression alive is the challenge of the monastic communities. I mean, the current pope, and I have great admiration for the pope and his humility and his desire to take on that helm of such a big institution, probably the largest in the world, and complex. But the life of the monastic movements, a little bit semi-autonomous from the formal structure of the church. More official structure of the church has been crucial in the work that they have been able to develop, centuries, and hopefully we'll see how many centuries into the future.
That's a very interesting perspective. Let's take a break here. I've kept you long than I already said I would, so I appreciate your time. Let's take a quick break, and we'll come back with some closing questions. All right, we're back with Reverend Dr. Juan Sarmiento, and really, he is downplaying the value of this entire conversation. I'll say I think it's been wonderful, and I think our listeners will agree. But these closing questions, tell folks you can take these as seriously or not as you'd like to. But if you're Pope for a day, what might you want to do? What would that day look like for you?
Well, I certainly hope I'm not Pope for a day or ever, right? and as I never intended to become the leader of a presbytery in a much more smaller scale. But I would say I would use whatever time I have to inspire trust in people, trust in God's ongoing work. As someone said, possibly sometimes slow work, but and also to highlight the exciting ways in which the Spirit is at work in the world today. That's what I would do. Now, I think a day wouldn't give you a chance to really bring about the institutional change that is necessary in our church and religious systems. But I think I'll possibly have some glimpses of those things will be helpful beyond that one day.
Awesome. A theologian or historical Christian figure you'd want to meet or bring back to life?
I've been thinking more recently about St. Augustine as a bishop, someone who had a trajectory of big shifts during his own personal life and dramatic conversion, but also someone that thought the faith, that felt the faith, someone that was influential to others during a time of big historical changes in the Roman Empire and was able to affirm the faith, recast the old faith in a way that makes sense to his day and age, and in a way that is still inspiring people to us. But as an African bishop, I identify with him as someone that probably is not likely to be the leader of a regional Protestant body in the United States. But also, I want to say, I mean, most of the people, I go back to my mission roots and the way mission work has inspired and missionaries have inspired. I think I would connect to nameless African Christian leaders that have witnessed to the reality of Christ, and that have not been prominent, whose names are not recorded in history books, but that have made an impact and shown just the life-giving influence of the gospel. That will be people that I want to spend time with.
Yeah, fabulous. What do you think history will remember from our current time and place?
I think history will remember folks that were able to remain grounded, healthy, going back to your comments about burnout.
Yeah.
And steadfast, faithful, and people that were joyous in the midst of everything. I think people, next generations will remember folks like that.
What are your hopes for the future of Christianity?
Oh, I'm excited about the future of Christianity. I think my hope is that we could learn to cry with those that cry and rejoice with those that rejoice, and be more closer together, less isolated among ourselves. And I think, needless to say, I think Christianity still has a compelling story to tell, that is not about us. It's not about how great we are, but about how great God is.
Yeah. Well, where can people connect with you, connect with the Presbytery, that sort of thing? Well,
I'm notoriously bad in answering emails, so probably people should not try to connect with me. But LinkedIn is a good way to see regular posts and perhaps try to engage. I would say probably cyclical will be a good way of engaging. Certainly, our Presbytery as an old institution started in 1968. So we try to pick up the phone. So you can Google Presbyterian San Fernando and find the phone number there, and hopefully get a live person to leave us a message.
I just saw a post this week that amongst Gen Z, the trend is to leave voice memos and to send voice memos by phone. Imagine who knew that you could do the same thing actually by dialing a number and getting a person. Maybe.
I know, that's a revolutionary, leaving a voicemail message.
Well, thank you so much for your time. I always leave folks with a word of peace, so may God's peace be with you.
Thank you, Lauren, and also with you and with everyone listening.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining us on the Future Christian Podcast. To learn more about Lauren or the podcast, visit future-christian.com. One more thing before you go. Do us a favor and subscribe to the podcast. And if you're feeling especially generous, leave a review. It really helps us get the word out to more people about the podcast. The Future Christian Podcast is a production of Torn Curtain Arts and Resonate Media. Our episodes were mixed by Danny Burton, and the production support is provided by Paul Romig-Levitt. Thanks, and go in peace.